Okay, I'm Mark Harper from the second group. I think we had a lot of similar ideas to the first group in terms of a need to expand Shannon's ideas in either a multi-scale way, either meaning like multiple levels of interaction or multiple timescales of interaction, as well as reflecting some of the earlier talks about how to measure analog information or how information spreads spatially. So implicitly, the answer to the first question is, does it need to be extended, is yes. And here's our suggestions or ideas of how maybe. In a biological context, of course, we want to use evolution as a guide. So we think thinking about biological information in terms of evolution could help us come up with the right definitions, the right ways of thinking about it. And in also trying to reconcile, as the previous group mentioned, timescales like the lifetime of a cell versus the evolutionary lifetime. One of the questions that came up in the discussion earlier this morning is, if we think of evolution as some kind of optimizing process, what is it really optimizing? And you have to think about long-term survivability of your organisms, right? It's not so important to do whatever they're doing in the best possible way as it is to also maintain diversity in the population so that you can survive evolutionary shocks or environmental changes, for example. So the objective function is not simply, like in a machine learning algorithm where we're trying to get best possible performance on one task. We also need to maintain enough diversity to be able to handle the way that that task changes as the environment changes. We also talked a lot about how to use the language from information theory in a biological context, which again, I think the previous group mentioned. So thinking about information in terms of reduction of uncertainty rather than the first thing being trying to figure out where the information is being transmitted from and to whom and what the channel is, which is sort of overly specific to the coding theory application manner of using information theory. And that goes along with how do we interpret information theory in biology. You could say, for example, information's in the eye of the beholder, but what is that in biology? Is it the protein that receives the signal? Is it the experimentalist on the outside that's observing the chemical changes due to the signal from the cell? Is it how the population changes over time, for example? And how do we define this kind of analog information in a general way rather than just an ad hoc approach per each system? The other thing we talked about in this section was, how do we decide if information theory is appropriate for a given biological problem? Is there a sequence of steps that we can go through or properties of the problem that we can think about that says, yes, information theory is going to be a good application for whatever we're trying to study in this particular context? And if not, why? Again, reflecting some of what the first group said, there's lots of people from different disciplines trying to blend information theory with physics or dynamical systems, but sometimes the concepts are hard for people who aren't experts in both of those fields to understand. And also there seem to be ideas of how information is used in different disciplines that maybe aren't being well ported across. So one, trying to increase those collaborations and then also try to make them more understandable. In terms of tools, we thought there's a real lack of good examples of how to go through this full process of applying information theory to a given problem. How do you go about identifying the information sources and the sinks and where the information flows? How do you decide how to model that information flow? So the analogy we used was like when you learn Newton's law in physics, you're taught a technique to make a free body diagram and to line up all the forces and then to apply the appropriate formula. What's the analog of that in this context that can help people who are just new to using information theory figure out how to apply it to a given problem? And so there should be some kind of repository for that or some kind of place to ask questions and get help, some kind of Stack Overflow type website. And then more broadly, going back to one of the earlier points, what questions can or should be answered by Shannon's paradigm? Maybe not every question in biology needs information theory, for example, and developing and socializing some guiding principles on how to do that would be very helpful. That's it for Group 2. Who's Group 3 leader?
On your point about variation being important for biological systems, it turns out that there are DNA polymerases that cause mutation at a certain rate. There are mutations of the polymerase itself that decrease the error rate. So that means that the error rate is actually set by evolution, and that's following. So that forces the system to be able to always have variation. Otherwise, if it went, down, so you'd have no errors, then there would be no variation, and the species would be vulnerable to changes in the environment.
Right, and there's also examples of bacteria, for example, when they're under strong selection, of changing their mutation rate, or effectively having a higher mutation rate. So even though it is set by evolution, it can still be variable depending on the context.